You may be lying down now, eyelids heavy, ready to let go of the day. I invite you to imagine something that sounds unbearably dull, yet strangely comforting in its monotony. The endless rows of medieval tax records. Close your eyes, and think of a quiet stone chamber. The air is cool, and it smells faintly of old parchment and wax. In one corner, a candle sputters, the flame bending in the draught that seeps under the heavy wooden door. You hear the scratch of a quill, deliberate and patient. A clerk bends over a wide sheet of parchment, shoulders hunched, ink smudging his fingers. Eyes sore from hours of repetition. Line after line, he copies names. He copies amounts. He copies debts. Nothing exciting happens. Nothing dramatic occurs. Yet in those lines lies the life of an entire village. Why do tax records matter? Because they are, in their very dullness, reliable. Kings and lords might exaggerate their victories. Priests might sermonize and embellish the deeds of saints. Poets might sing of glory. But a tax collector, he only cared about counting. He wanted to know exactly how many bushels of grain you had harvested, how many sheep grazed in your pasture, how many hens clucked in your yard. He wrote it down because someone demanded payment. And so, line by line, he left behind the truth of ordinary life. Imagine yourself not as a knight or noble, but as a farmer's wife, or a village widow, or even a young apprentice learning to read these records. Your whole existence, from the bread you baked to the sheep you sheared, could be reduced to a figure in ink. Perhaps you owed 3 eggs every week to the manor. Perhaps you owed 1 lamb at Easter. Perhaps your house was taxed for the smoke that rose from its chimney. Boring, yes, but also precise. Without realizing it, that clerk preserved your life across centuries. The chamber is silent, except for the quill scratching. A clerk dips the nib back into the inkpot. He straightens his back with a sigh. Then, carefully, he writes again. Another name, another obligation, another debt. The scroll grows longer, the parchment heavier. He ties it with cord, labels it with the year, and sets it aside in a chest already overflowing with such records. Centuries later, a historian unrolls that same scroll. The ink has faded to brown. The parchment is stiff, but the names remain. The obligations remain. Each one, once dull, now precious. We can see who lived in the village, who owned 1 cow, who shared a field with 3 brothers, who fell into debt, and who prospered quietly. These details form the bones of history, not its flashy decorations. So as you lie here, listening, drifting, you may find the monotony soothing. Lists of debts, lists of hens, lists of rents. The very boredom that makes these records tedious also makes them a gentle rhythm, like the ticking of a clock. Reliable, repetitive, safe, and perhaps, as you imagine the endless columns of names, you too feel yourself settling into stillness. Let us sink a little deeper into that world. The medieval tax record was not a story meant to entertain. It was not a chronicle of battles or kings. It was, instead, a ledger, a dry catalogue of obligations. Yet, in its stillness, it has a power that other sources do not. Because here, in the margins of the parchment, in the cramped handwriting of anonymous clerks, lie the forgotten lives of countless ordinary people. Picture a village on a gray morning. The mist hangs low, blurring the outlines of cottages thatched with straw. Men and women shuffle out, tending to animals, fetching water, beginning the day's work. None of them imagine that their names will survive hundreds of years later. And yet, when the tax collector arrives, notebook in hand, they step forward, one by one. Their contributions are noted. Alfred, 2 hens. Marjorie, a measure of barley. John, 1 lamb. There is no poetry in this, only obligation. Still, because it was written, it endured. The clerk may have grumbled. He may have been weary, but he was thorough. Accuracy mattered more than beauty. If a name was wrong, If a number was missed, someone would pay the price. And so, the handwriting is steady, the entries careful. The parchment is filled edge to edge, leaving no space for imagination. It is as if boredom itself has been captured and preserved, word by word. There is comfort in that dullness. History so often tells us of kings, of wars, of conquests. But the true weight of life was carried by people who will never have monuments or statues. Their presence is here instead, hidden inside lists of payments. You can almost hear their sighs as they gave up the eggs, or parted with a small sack of oats. They were not remarkable people, but they were people. And the records remind us that the ordinary mattered. Think for a moment of the Doomsday Book in England, compiled in 1086. An enormous survey. It listed every village, every obligation owed to the crown. It is not an exciting read. Page after page, it lists plows, cows, meadows, mills, fisheries. But through it, we glimpse a kingdom alive, with small details. Who owned 3 pigs? Who had half a meadow? Who owed service to a lord? In the monotony lies the texture of real life. As you listen, let your breathing slow. The rhythm of names and numbers becomes like a lullaby, unchanging, predictable. That is why these records matter. They anchor us, showing that even the most ordinary lives had weight enough to be counted. They strip away the noise of legend and bring us back to the quiet reality of survival. And so, you drift with them. Each line, another life. Each entry, another reminder that history is not only kings and battles, but the dull persistence of everyday obligations. The boredom itself becomes soothing, like the soft murmur of distant voices, fading into sleep. Now imagine the hands that held these records, roughened by work, ink-stained, calloused by quill and parchment. The clerk was not a knight, nor a nobleman, but he carried power through his pen. For each line he inscribed, another villager's responsibility was fixed in time. The list would outlast them all. The people who appeared in the margins, peasants, widows, tenant farmers, rarely thought of themselves as part of history. They struggled through long days, often hungry, sometimes ill, always weary. And yet, when their names were written, they entered the historical memory of their land, not in glory, not in triumph, but in obligation. That is the strange gift of tax records, to preserve the invisible. Take, for example, a manor in 13th century France. The records might note, Pierre, 3 hens, 1 bushel wheat, Isabel, 1 piglet, 6 eggs, nothing more. And yet, from these short entries, we learn about the animals they kept, the crops they grew, the burdens they carried. The boredom of the entry becomes the richness of understanding. The clerk never meant to capture their lives in detail, yet he did. The very act of writing down obligations left traces of humanity that still whispered to us across the centuries. We do not know Pierre's laughter, Isabel's voice, the sound of their children's feet on the earth, but we know the tax they paid. We know they lived, because the parchment says so. These records were, at the time, instruments of control. They kept peasants accountable, ensured the lord received his due, reminded everyone of their place. But now, they are instruments of memory. They remind us that history is not built only by rulers, but by countless hands who tilled, sowed, baked, carried, and gave. They remind us that existence itself, however ordinary, mattered enough to be written down. Picture the scrolls stacked in a wooden chest. Dust gathers, leather straps crack, mice scurry in corners. The clerk has long since gone. The peasants have returned to the soil. The lords have been forgotten. But the lists remain unchanged. The names, still legible, wait for a distant reader. That reader may be a modern historian, leaning over the manuscript in a silent archive, tracing the faded ink with tired eyes. Or it may be you, drifting to sleep, imagining the monotony of those lists as a quiet hum in the background of history. The beauty of boredom is that it levels everything. No one is heroic here. No one is singled out for greatness. Everyone is reduced to entries, side by side. This sameness becomes strangely calming. It is not a tale of rise and fall, but of endless continuity. Each hen, each egg, each bushel becomes another beat in the rhythm of medieval life. And as you listen, you might feel your breath aligning with that rhythm, slow and steady, as though your own life were written in the margins too, one quiet obligation after another. Think, for a moment, of the silence in which these records were made. Outside the chamber, the village bustled, faintly carts creaking, animals lowing, children calling. But inside, the only sound was the steady scrape of the quill. The clerk's world narrowed to ink and parchment, his life bound to repetition. He did not tell stories. He did not compose poetry. He counted, and in counting, he unknowingly gave shape to the lives of others. To the peasant, the tax was a burden. It was the loss of a measure of grain that might have fed the family through winter. It was the surrender of eggs that could have been sold at market. Each entry meant less for the hearth, less for the stomach. Yet, to the historian, centuries later, these sacrifices are the very evidence of existence. They show us who had enough to give, and who did not. They show us how survival balanced on the edge of obligation. Imagine lying on a straw mattress in a thatched cottage. The day's work done, the debt still owed. Perhaps tomorrow, you must hand over a sack of barley. Perhaps you will argue with the collector. Perhaps you will beg for more time. None of this drama enters the record. Only the final payment appears. The humanity is lost, yet preserved in absence. Each cold number carries with it the warmth of countless forgotten struggles. And so, the tax records matter not because they are exciting, but because they are steady. They are monotonous, yes, but they are also honest. They cared little for exaggeration. They did not flatter lords, nor praise kings, nor invent miracles. They counted, they listed, they endured. Centuries pass, empires rise and fall. Yet, in the dusty archive, the roll of parchment still waits. You unroll it carefully, the vellum crackling softly. The ink is faded, but legible. A list of names greets you, row upon row, all silent now. The people are gone, their voices stilled, but their obligations whisper on the page. It is boring history. And in its boredom, it is strangely soothing. No surprises lurk here, no sudden twists. Only the certainty of lists, the comfort of repetition. For those who love calm storytelling, this is a gentle rhythm to rest upon. The tax records mattered because they did not seek to matter. And perhaps, as you lie back now, you too can feel their steady presence, anchoring you in the quiet truth that ordinary lives, counted carefully, form the foundation of history itself. So let the names fade into murmurs. Let the numbers drift like soft rain. The boredom becomes a lullaby, carrying you into rest, reminding you that even in monotony there is meaning, and in that stillness, you may find sleep. Picture again the chamber where the tax records were born. It was not a grand hall, nor a comfortable study. Often, it was a cold corner of a monastery, or a drafty room in the manor house, lit by a single candle or a narrow window. The man who sat there was not powerful in appearance. He wore plain wool, perhaps patched from long use. His hands were stained dark with ink. He was the medieval clerk. The world of the clerk was a world of repetition. Day after day, he bent his back over parchment. His work was not celebrated. He did not fight in wars or preach from pulpits. He copied, he calculated, he wrote. His power lay in accuracy, in the patient act of transcribing what others owed. He was often anonymous, his name never appearing in the very records he created. And yet, without him, the system of taxation would collapse. Consider his tools. A quill cut carefully from a goose feather, sharpened again and again. Ink, black and heavy, mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and gum. sheets of parchment, costly and precious, scraped smooth from animal skin. Each item a product of labor in itself, each requiring skill and patience before it even reached his desk. The clerk did not waste space. Every margin was filled, every line used. Mistakes were costly, and corrections messy. So he learned to move slowly, steadily, without flourish. His day was long. In the morning, perhaps he attended a short service if he worked in a monastic scriptorium. Then, with little ceremony, he took his place at the desk. The light was dim, his posture stiff, but the work had to be done. A steady rhythm, dip the quill, draw the line, record the name, note the debt, over and over. Hours passed like this, the silence broken only by coughs, the shifting of benches, or the faint creak of wood. Outside, life was vivid animals, voices, markets, seasons. But inside, the clerk was surrounded by stillness. His labor removed him from the world he was recording. He did not till the fields, yet he listed their harvests. He did not raise the hens, yet he counted their eggs. He was both part of society, and apart from it, a quiet observer tasked with reducing life to ink. The world of the medieval clerk was monotonous, yes, but it was also strangely essential. He was invisible, yet his hand preserved the visible traces of everyone else. Each name he wrote down might belong to a family who never left the village, never saw beyond the next field. Yet, because of him, their existence remains for us to read today. His boredom became our knowledge. Imagine the clerk's morning as the bell tolled across the village. He walked to his chamber with quiet steps, his breath misting in the chill air. The room was still, the stone walls holding the cold long after dawn. He arranged his tools carefully, quill on the right, inkpot just so, parchment weighted with a small stone to keep it flat. There was no rush, only the steady demand of endless names waiting to be recorded. He dipped the quill, tapped it lightly on the rim, and began. The sound was a soft scratching, like a mouse in the rafters. He wrote the name of a villager, then the amount owed to hens, a measure of rye, a single coin. Line after line, each the same. He shifted his weight on the wooden bench, feeling the stiffness in his legs. He sighed, but his hand kept moving. His task was not glorious, but it was necessary. Clerks were trained to keep their letters uniform, small, efficient. They learned to abbreviate common Latin words, so that space was not wasted. To us, the script looks dense and cramped, almost unreadable. But to him, each flourish, each abbreviation was second nature. He did not think of beauty. He thought of accuracy. For the tax collector, numbers mattered more than elegance. Sometimes he paused, waiting for the ink to dry. He might rub his fingers together, feeling the roughness of skin hardened by constant writing. He might stretch his shoulders, glance toward the narrow slit of a window, and see only gray sky. Then, with a resigned breath, he bent again to the task. The world outside went on without him, the animals, the market, the children at play. But he remained here, bound to the record. There were moments of tedium that blurred together. Did he already write William to sheep? Had he copied the same name twice? He checked, finger running down the parchment, eyes scanning the cramped lines. He had to be sure. One mistake could mean a loss for the Lord, or punishment for himself. And so he was careful, plodding, deliberate. In the silence, the hours dragged. Yet there was a kind of rhythm to it, almost meditative. Names, debts, payments, quill, ink, parchment, the same words, the same entries, repeated over and over. For the clerk, this was life. And though he may have longed for variety, for conversation, even for rest, he continued, because duty required it. Centuries later, his monotony becomes our gift. Each line he wrote offers a glimpse of a village, of families who would otherwise be forgotten. Each careful letter preserves a fragment of the past. He could not have known that his boredom would become the foundation of our knowledge. But that is the quiet paradox of the medieval clerk. As the day wore on, the light in the clerk's chamber changed. In the morning it was pale and sharp, streaming faintly through the narrow slit of a window. By midday it grew brighter, though never enough to banish the gloom. In winter, the daylight was gone before his tasks were finished, leaving him to squint by the flicker of a candle or an oil lamp. His eyes ached, the letters blurring, yet he pressed on, line after line. Because the accounts had to be complete. The clerk's diet was plain bread, a little cheese, perhaps ale. At times he chewed slowly while continuing to write, careful not to smear grease across the parchment. Food was fuel, nothing more. The rhythm of his life was dictated not by hunger or pleasure, but by the demands of parchment and ink. He might pause for a moment of prayer, perhaps to stretch stiff fingers, but then he returned, bound to the endless ledger. Sometimes he worked alongside others. A room of clerks could be nearly silent, save for the collective scratching of quills, an occasional cough, or the shuffle of parchment. No conversation, no laughter, only the steady industry of men recording the world in numbers and names. Each man bent low, lost in his own lines. They were companions in boredom, united by duty, separated by silence. And yet, for all its monotony, this work required skill. A poorly cut quill splattered ink. A weak hand produced uneven letters. Spilled ink could ruin a sheet of parchment worth more than a week's wages. The clerk had to be precise, controlled, steady. His mastery was not in art, but in discipline. His letters may not inspire poetry, but their accuracy kept the economy of the manor or the kingdom running. Imagine the mental world of such a man. Day after day, week after week, the same obligations crossed his desk. Did he dream of the villagers whose names he wrote? Did he ever wonder about their lives, their laughter, their grief? Or did he see only numbers, only burdens owed? Perhaps he grew numb to the human reality behind the ink. Perhaps, in moments of weariness, he let his mind drift, but always his hand returned to the line, steady and exact. The boredom was unrelenting, but within it lay a strange endurance. He became invisible, yet indispensable. His life was bound to parchment, and because of that, the lives of others were preserved. His tedium became their legacy. That is the quiet world of the medieval clerk, lonely, repetitive, necessary, and oddly timeless. The seasons shaped the clerk's labor as much as the peasant's toil did. In spring, when fields came alive with new growth, fresh taxes were assessed. In summer, after the harvest, records swelled with entries of grain and barley, carefully measured and accounted for. Autumn brought lists of livestock, their numbers tallied before they were sold or slaughtered. And in the deep cold of winter, when the fields slept, the clerk still worked, compiling, reviewing, and storing the year's obligations. Unlike the farmer, he did not rest when the ground froze. His duty was constant. The clerk's world was not glamorous. He might never leave the manor, the monastery, or the small town where he lived. His days passed in sameness. He wrote by the same window, at the same desk, breathing the same drafty air. Perhaps he saw his work as tiresome. Perhaps he muttered complaints under his breath when ink spilled or parchment tore. But he knew his labor mattered to those above him. The Lord relied on his accuracy. The bailiff depended on his lists. And so he continued, even when his back ached, even when his sight dimmed. For those who worked the land, the clerk must have seemed distant, perhaps even unfeeling. They saw him as the hand that confirmed their burdens. Yet, in truth, he was often little better off than they. His wages were modest. His food was simple. His role carried responsibility, but little honor. He was a servant of the system, bound as tightly by duty as the peasants were by obligation. The ink that stained his fingers was another form of toil, quieter but no less consuming. Imagine him at the end of a long day. He sets the quill aside, stretches his stiff shoulders, and blows gently on the parchment to help the ink dry. He looks at the page filled with names and numbers and feels no pride, only relief that another sheet is complete. He ties the record with string, places it carefully in a chest, and extinguishes the candle. Tomorrow, he will do the same again, and the day after, and the day after that. His life becomes a rhythm of ink and obligation, as predictable as the toll of the church bell. Centuries later, the monotony that weighed so heavily on him becomes precious to us. We read his cramped script, not for beauty, but for truth. We glimpsed the hum of ordinary life through his weary hand. He would not have imagined himself a historian, and yet he became one. Without intending, he left us the most reliable mirror of medieval society, a reflection built of boredom, accuracy, and persistence. When we think of the medieval clerk, it is tempting to imagine a single figure endlessly repeating the same tasks. Yet, across Europe, there were thousands like him. Some worked in manorial courts, recording the dues of peasants. Others labored in royal treasuries, compiling rolls that stretched on 4 yards. A few copied accounts in monasteries, their quiet script mingling taxes with prayers. Each man belonged to the same fraternity of boredom, linked by ink and duty. They were not celebrated, and few names survive, but the uniformity of their writing, the discipline of their hand, speaks to a shared world of training and practice. A clerk might begin as a boy, learning his letters slowly, tracing them again and again until they became second nature. He learned to sharpen quills, to mix ink, to keep parchment flat against the board. His skill was patience. His achievement was accuracy. His career was a lifetime of lists. The monotony shaped him. Day after day, he absorbed the steady hum of repetition. Perhaps he grew numb to the meaning of the words, seeing only the form. Perhaps he found a kind of comfort in the predictability. Whatever the case, he endured, because the system depended on him. If he faltered, if he grew careless, the delicate balance of rents and dues would unravel. And so he pressed on, his hands steady, even when his spirit flagged. At times, small signs of his humanity broke through. A doodle in the margin, a flourish on a letter, a faint correction where the ink had smeared. These were glimpses of the man behind the record, reminders that he was more than a machine. Yet even these touches were rare. The record itself demanded invisibility. The clerk's hand was to serve the system, not himself, and so his life passed quietly, bound to parchment, unnoticed by most. When he died, another clerk took his place, and the work continued, unbroken. Generations of clerks filled chest after chest with their careful writing, leaving behind not names of heroes, but lists of hens, lambs, and coins. Their labor was not dramatic, but it was enduring. For us, centuries later, their tedium is a blessing. Without it, the lives of ordinary medieval people would be shadows, guessed at, but never certain. Because of the clerks, we know who lived where, who paid what, who struggled, and who prospered. Their boredom became our knowledge. Their invisibility became our vision. Thus ends the world of the medieval clerk, a world of silence, patience, and repetition. Not glorious, not thrilling, but steady, unchanging, and strangely soothing. In their monotony, they built a bridge across time, one that allows us to see the ordinary lives of the past more clearly than any battle or coronation ever could. The heart of the medieval tax record was not the handwriting, nor even the parchment, but the obligations it described. To understand the boredom of these records, we must walk slowly through the different kinds of taxes that filled their lines. Each was small on its own egg here. A coin there, but together they wove the net that bound medieval society. One of the simplest was the hearth tax. In some kingdoms, you paid simply for having a fire. The smoke rising from your chimney was proof enough of occupation, and so, a mark of responsibility. A clerk might note, 3 hearths, 3 payments. It was easy to calculate, and impossible to avoid. Every family needed warmth, and so, page after page, the rolls listed hearths, 1, 2, 5. Nothing poetic, only the dull tally of homes that dared to burn fuel against the cold. Another was the poll tax, levied not on property, but on people. Each adult was counted, and each paid the same amount. The poorest peasant, with nothing but ragged clothes, owed the same as a wealthy merchant. Unsurprisingly, such taxes stirred resentment. Yet, on parchment, they appear neutral, unfeeling. John, 1 coin. Agnes, 1 coin. William, 1 coin. The uniformity of the list hides the inequality beneath it. The tithe was different, for it belonged to the church. Every household was meant to surrender 1/10 of its produce grain, wool, honey, or livestock. To peasants, this meant partying with food they might desperately need. To clerks, it meant another list to compile. 10 sheaves of barley, 1 set aside. 10 lambs born, 1 given to the church. The rhythm of tens, the endless fractions, made their way into the margins, line after line. Then there were feudal dues, perhaps the most varied and confusing. These obligations tied peasants to their lords in webs of service. Some owed labor working the lord's fields a few days each week. Some owed produce part of their crop, their animals, their cheese. Others paid in money, though coin was scarce. The clerk reduced it all to neat entries, stripping away the complexity of lived effort. Hours of toil became a few words, 2 days plowing, 1 pig, 3 coins. Finally, there were extraordinary levies, raised in times of war or crisis. A king might demand funds for a campaign, or a lord for repairing his castle. These taxes were irregular, but the records are filled with them. They tell of moments when rulers reached deeper into the pockets of their subjects, and clerks scrambled to write faster, longer, more. The scrolls grew heavy with names, while the people groaned under the weight. Each kind of tax carried its own rhythm, but together they blended into the same monotone. Name, obligation, amount, repeat. For the clerk, it was an endless cycle. For the villager, it was a constant burden. For us, it is the quiet hum of a world where every life was counted, not in triumphs, but in dues. If we linger a little longer with these taxes, their sheer variety begins to blur together. To the clerk, they were categories to be recorded. To the peasant, they were losses to be endured. Each type of tax added a new layer to the parchment, and to the daily life of the village. Consider again the hearth tax. Its simplicity was deceptive. A family might try to avoid it by sharing 1 fire, crowding into a single smoky room. The record, however, showed no compassion. It counted chimneys, not suffering. 1 hearth, 1 tax. In the roll, the entry was short, unemotional, yet behind it lay the image of a family huddled together, coughing in the thick air, saving pennies by breathing the same smoke. The poll tax was harsher still. Because it struck everyone equally, it revealed the gulf between rich and poor. For a merchant, the fee was trivial. For a laborer, it meant hunger. The clerk, though, did not mark the difference. He wrote the names in order, the same sum beside each. Long lists of identical amounts, monotonous and cold, were his entire concern. In that uniformity, resentment smoldered, and in some places, revolt eventually rose. But the record itself remained steady, blind to consequence. The tithe reflected the weight of faith, 1/10 of everything, whether grain, honey, or lambswa set aside for the church. The clerk noted the divisions, reducing holy obligation to arithmetic. 10 sheaves, 1 to God. The language of devotion was replaced by the language of numbers. It was not his task to inspire reverence. It was his duty to ensure accuracy. Feudal dues were perhaps the most tedious to record, because they came in so many forms. A day of labor plowing, a measure of oats, a pair of chickens. Each had to be written clearly, so the Lord could enforce payment. For the villager, it meant days stolen from their own fields, food taken from their own table. For the clerk, it meant filling yet another page, listing yet another item in the endless parade of obligations. When emergencies came, war, famine, or construction, the extraordinary levies piled on top of the ordinary ones. The parchment grew crowded, margins filled with hurried notes. A village already strained by tithes and dues now owed more. The clerk, unmoved, kept writing. 2 coins for the king's campaign. 1 cartload of timber for the bridge. These entries told stories of hardship, though they were written in the most boring of ways. And so, the record swelled, heavy with taxes of every kind. For the people, it was a burden that shaped their entire existence. For the clerk, it was a catalogue that filled his days. For us, it is a window into the ordinary reality of medieval life. The very boredom of these lists is what makes them precious. They remind us that history is not only banners and battles, but smoke from a hearth, a sack of oats, a tally of hens. Among the most famous of all medieval tax records is the Domesday Book, compiled in England in the year 1086. Commissioned by William the Conqueror, it was meant to be a great survey of his new kingdom, a way to know, in precise detail, who owned what and how much they owed. And yet, despite the grandeur of its purpose, the Domesday Book is at its heart boring. Open its pages, and you will not find stirring tales of conquest. You will not see the drama of battles or the poetry of kingship. Instead, you will find lists, villages, households, plows, cows, pigs, mills, and fisheries. Each entry is clipped, efficient, and repetitive. In such and such village, there are 10 hides of land. There are 5 plow teams. There are 2 mills worth so many shillings. Over and over, page after page. It was not written to entertain. It was written to control. William wished to know exactly what his realm could provide, in taxes, in food, in soldiers. And so as clerks traveled, questioned, measured, and recorded, every villager, every piece of land, every cow, became part of the account. Their lives, boiled down to numbers, were written in ink that would endure for centuries. Imagine the process. Clerks moving from village to village, quills ready, asking the same questions again and again. Farmers answering with weary honesty, or perhaps with hesitation, fearing higher demands. Lords pressing their claims, insisting they had more men, more resources. The clerks listened, wrote, and moved on. For them, the task was tedious. For the villagers, it was intimidating. For us, it is a record of immense detail, both dull and priceless. The Domesday Book was divided into 2 volumes, known as Great Domesday and Little Domesday. They were not elegant manuscripts, but working documents, filled with cramped Latin abbreviations. To the modern reader, they appeared dense, uninviting, and exhausting to decipher. Yet within them lies a snapshot of England unlike any other, so thorough that no corner of the land escaped its reach. Think of a small village, lost in time, forgotten by chronicles of kings. The Domesday Book lists its people, its animals, its resources. Without that record, we might never know it existed. But because a clerk wrote it down, it lingers, its quiet details whispering across the centuries and beyond doomsday. There were countless other rolls and registers across Europe, manorial accounts in France, tax lists in the Holy Roman Empire, tallies of towns in Italy. Each one, though local, shared the same character: endless repetition, endless dullness, endless truth. What makes the Domesday Book so striking is not only its thoroughness but its survival. Bound in worn leather, preserved in archives for centuries, it has outlived every villager it described. The people who once worried over the taxes are long gone, but their fields, their mills, Their herds of sheep remain in ink. Their names and obligations became part of a ledger, so important that it was guarded like a crown jewel. For the clerks, it was simply another duty. For us, it is a monument of monotony that endures. Other rolls followed the same pattern. In England, the pipe rolls of the Exchequer stretched year after year, recording royal revenues in unbroken sequence from the 12th century onward. Imagine a roll of parchment so long it could stretch across a hall, covered in neat, cramped script. Each entry was a payment, a fine, a debt collected for the king. The rolls piled up, filling chests until they were too heavy to lift. To the clerks, they were a burden of ink. To historians, they are a treasure of continuity. In France, the tale rolls listed villagers and their dues to the crown. In Italy, the city-states recorded households with relentless precision, ensuring every coin was accounted for. Across Europe, the same pattern repeated: names, numbers, obligations. The language might shift, the rulers might change, but the rhythm of taxation was steady, almost timeless. These records share a certain sameness, no matter their origin. Open one, and you will see the same cramped lines, the same repetitive abbreviations, the same tallying of hens, sheep, or pennies. For the medieval clerk, this sameness must have been suffocating. For the modern reader, it is soporific. Yet the dullness is also the point. Accuracy demanded consistency, and consistency produced boredom. To imagine reading such a record for hours is to feel the weight of tedium. Yet that same weight is soothing for us now. The entries do not surprise. They do not excite. They simply list, line after line, a world of obligation. In their silence, they offer a kind of rest. They remind us that beneath the noise of history battles, speeches, and kings there was always this steady undercurrent of ordinary life, recorded without flourish. So the Doomsday Book, the pipe rolls, the tale registers, all of them stand as monuments to boredom. They show us not the glory of the medieval world, but its routine. They are dull to read, exhausting to copy, but invaluable in their quiet truth. They matter precisely because they did not try to matter, and in their monotony, they have preserved the shape of medieval life more faithfully than any tale of knights or kings ever could. If we lean closer to the pages of these tax records, past the Latin abbreviations and the cramped handwriting, we begin to see something more than numbers. We see the outlines of daily life, ordinary, repetitive, but deeply human. A list of hens tells us that families kept small flocks in their yards. A tally of bushels shows how much grain the fields produced, and how tightly survival depended on each harvest. A note about a mill reminds us that even the hum of grinding grain was tied to obligation. Consider the value of a cow. To us, it may seem trivial, but in the medieval village, a cow meant milk, cheese, calves, and, ultimately, survival. When a clerk wrote, "1 cow, worth so many shillings," he reduced that lifeline to a figure on parchment. But through that figure, we glimpse how wealth was measured not in gold, but in the steady, living rhythm of animals. A list of sheep or pigs was more than inventory, it was the heartbeat of a household. The records also capture hardship. When we see names struck through, or entries reduced, it may mean a family had less to give that year. Perhaps because of famine, disease, or misfortune. When the same villager appears year after year with small dues to hens, 1 lamb, half an acre of meadowy, sense the grinding stability of poverty. Nothing changes, nothing grows. The monotony of the record mirrors the monotony of their lives. Yet, there are glimpses of variation. A sudden note of a new mill, a vineyard, or a fishery signals innovation and local pride. A villager who once owed nothing now owes a pig, suggesting growth, small but real. Even in boredom, life shifted, slowly and quietly. For us, centuries later, these traces are precious. They remind us that history is not only palaces and cathedrals, but cottages and fields. The tax rolls show us how much bread could be baked, how many fires warmed the night, how many hands tilled the soil. They anchor us in the lived reality of peasants whose voices never reached the chronicles of kings. So, though the records seem dull, they reveal the rhythm of life itself: hens clucking, grain ripening, coins clinking in calloused hands. They show us not drama, but endurance. And in their monotony, they whisper the truth that history is built not only on battles, but on the steady persistence of ordinary people, counted carefully, year after year. Behind the clerk's neat lines and the Lord's steady demands lay the true weight of taxation, the burden borne by the poor. For peasants, taxes were not abstract sums. They were food removed from the table, time taken from their own fields, animals lost from their herds. Each entry in the record so clean, so matter-of-fact was, in reality, a subtraction from survival. Think of a family owing a tithe of grain. To the clerk, it was a tenth of the harvest neatly written in Latin shorthand. To the family, it was the difference between eating through the winter or facing hunger. When a lamb was demanded, the parchment merely noted its value, but to the household, it meant one less source of wool, milk, and future wealth. The boredom of the record hides the desperation of the people it described. The poorest peasants had little chance to escape. While nobles might negotiate exemptions and towns might buy privileges, villagers were caught in an unbroken cycle. Each year, the same dues appeared. Each year, the same clerk copied the same names. If a harvest failed, the obligations did not vanish. Debt grew, sometimes binding families into deeper dependence on their lords. The ink did not falter, even when stomachs were empty. Resentment brewed quietly. The poll taxes of the 14th century, flat and harsh, pressed on rich and poor alike. The clerk recorded one coin, but the weight was unequal. For the wealthy, it was a nuisance. For the poor, it was unbearable. Such taxes fed unrest, even rebellion, though the records themselves reveal nothing of anger. They remain calm, orderly, as if hardship could be made invisible by neat handwriting. And yet, within those same lists, we glimpse resistance. Missing entries suggest avoidance, perhaps villagers hiding livestock or underreporting harvests. Delays in payment hint at struggle. Scribes sometimes noted arrears, showing how common it was for peasants to fall behind. Though unspoken, the strain is visible in the silences of the record. The burden of taxes on the poor was constant, grinding, and often invisible to those who demanded them. But for us, centuries later, the monotony of these obligations speaks loudly. It reminds us that history was not lived in castles or courts alone, but in cottages, where families counted their eggs, measured their grain, and worried about the next demand. The records, in their boring honesty, tell us of lives lived under pressure, steady as the turning of the seasons. The tax records, with their steady lists of hens, coins, and grain, seem silent about hardship. But if we look closely, we can hear the echoes of suffering, disease, famine, and fear woven into their monotony. The lines are calm, the script is measured, but between the entries lies a world of fragility. Consider disease. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept through Europe, carrying away entire villages. The tax rolls tell the story not through vivid description, but through absence. A clerk copied fewer names. Obligations once noted disappeared. Villages shrank on parchment just as they shrank in life. What had been 20 households was suddenly 10, then 5, then none at all. The record did not mourn, did not pause, it simply listed what remained. In that silence, we sense the devastation more deeply than any dramatic account. Even without plague, illness shaped life. A sick child might mean less labor in the fields, less food on the table, and greater difficulty meeting dues. When a widow's name replaced a husband's in the ledger, it was a quiet reminder of loss. The record kept no tears, only transactions. But behind every change in name or payment lay a human story of grief. Then there was famine. Poor harvests were common, brought by harsh winters, storms, or failed crops. In those years, the clerk's entries reveal strain. Payments might be reduced, delayed, or recorded as arrears. A note of debt, cold and plain, stands in for hunger, gnawing at empty stomachs. The parchment carried no hint of despair, but the villagers felt it keenly. 2 a sack of grain in a year when none could be spared was to face the cruel choice between feeding children or satisfying the Lord. Fear was constant. Fear of collectors, fear of punishment, fear of losing the little that sustained survival. Obligations were not suggestions. They were enforced. Refusal could mean fines, confiscation, or worse. So peasants complied, weary and resentful, their fear folded into each line of the record. The clerk may not have thought of this as he wrote, but we can read it now in the dry arithmetic of dues. And yet, there was also endurance. Year after year, through sickness and scarcity, villagers found a way to give something: an egg, a measure of oats, a lamb. The lists are monotonous, but they are also proof of persistence. Each name recorded, even in the hardest years, tells us of survival against the odds. Hardship was not confined to famine and plague. Everyday life carried risks that hovered just beneath the surface of the records. Accidents in the fields, injuries from tools, or wounds from animals could end a peasant's ability to work. When that happened, obligations did not vanish. The clerk's ledger rarely showed mercy. Instead, another family member might be listed, or the same dues might be marked as overdue. The cold ink reminds us that obligation endured, even when human strength failed. War, too, left its mark in subtle ways. Villages near conflict zones suffered raids or the passage of armies, leaving fields trampled and barns emptied. The records show the aftermath, not the violence. Lower yields, vanished livestock, missing payments. The clerk did not describe battles or burning, only the reduced accounts of what survived. Yet the monotony of those diminished numbers conveys more about loss than a dramatic chronicle could. Fear of authority pressed heavily. The Lord's steward, or the king's collector, was not a figure to defy. Villagers knew that resistance risked fines, seizure of property, or imprisonment. The tax rolls rarely mention punishment, but their very precision suggests enforcement. To be written down was to be held accountable. The clerk's pen became an extension of power, quiet but unrelenting. There were years when disaster layered upon disaster. A bad harvest might be followed by disease, then by extraordinary levies for war. The people, already exhausted, found themselves further burdened. Their suffering does not cry out from the parchment. Instead, it whispers in the shrinking totals, the shifting names, the debts carried forward. The silence of the records, their refusal to dramatize, is what makes them powerful. They show us hardship, not as spectacle, but as constant pressure. Yet, through all of this, the records also remind us of resilience. Families endured. Even when death struck, new names appeared to carry obligations forward. Villages contracted, but they did not vanish entirely. The ink flowed on, and with it, life continued in some form. Each entry, however dull, is proof of persistence. When you read these records today, or let them lull you as you drift to sleep, you can feel the rhythm of hardship and endurance blended together. The suffering is muted, flattened by the monotony of the lists, but it is there all the same. The very boredom of the records reflects the weary boredom of survival in a world where fear and loss were ordinary companions. And perhaps that is their greatest lesson. The tax records show us not exceptional moments, but the steady endurance of people who lived under constant strain. Their hardships may not stir excitement, but they stir empathy. And in their silence, we find the quiet truth of human fragility and resilience that connects us to them across the centuries. It may seem strange to look for joy in the margins of tax records. After all, these parchments were meant to weigh burdens, not to celebrate life. Yet, if we read them closely, small signs of happiness appear not directly, but in what they reveal of festivals, gatherings, and moments of relief. Even in a world of obligation, people found ways to laugh, to share, and to rest. Take, for example, entries that mention vineyards, breweries, or meadows used for grazing. Behind those simple notations lies community. Brewing ale was not only an economic task, it was also a social one. Neighbors gathered, mugs in hand, sharing stories while drinking the very product that appeared in the accounts as a taxable good. To the clerk, it was one barrel of ale. To the villagers, it was a reason to sing together. Seasonal festivals also peeked through the records. Payments in lambs or eggs often coincided with Easter. Obligations of grain tied to harvest time remind us of the communal celebrations that followed. After months of labor, when crops were safely gathered, the people came together dancing, feasting, and thanking heaven for survival. The clerk noted only the dues, but those dues point us toward the rhythm of festival life that broke the monotony of the year. Marriage settlements, too, are sometimes reflected in obligations. A dowry of livestock or land recorded in the rolls was more than a transaction. It was the start of a new household, a moment of promise in the village. Behind the dry line, one cow, transferred to the groom, was a day of celebration, music, and gathering. The record freezes only the obligation, but the community would have remembered the laughter. Even gossip, though invisible in the ink, lingers in the background. The villagers, who stood before the clerk, waiting to declare their dues, must have whispered about neighbors, joked quietly, or exchanged knowing glances. These interactions, though unrecorded, gave texture to their days. The clerk saw only names. The people lived the warmth of human connection. Thus, within the monotony of taxation, there were sparks of joy. They were not grand or glorious, but they mattered deeply, and in the calm pace of the records, we can imagine them as quiet undercurrents. The songs at the tavern, the laughter at weddings, the feasts after harvest. Life was not only burden, it was also togetherness. If the tax records reveal burdens through their lists of dues, they also hint, quietly, at relief. Some obligations were seasonal, appearing only once a year. When they were paid, a family might feel a brief moment of freedom before the next demand. That pause, however small, opened the door to joy. A lamb given at Easter might be followed by a feast. A sheaf of grain surrendered at harvest could be balanced by bread, baked and shared. Among neighbors, music and storytelling threaded through these gatherings, though the parchment does not preserve their sound. The rhythm of names and dues reminds us that rhythm existed elsewhere too, in song, in drum, in dance. Villagers, who were reduced to numbers on the page, were also singers around a fire, dancers on the green, storytellers spinning tales of saints, beasts, or mischievous spirits. The clerk's monotony and the villagers' merriment existed side by side. Two realities joined by obligation, but not consumed by it. Children's laughter is also hidden here. A note about livestock reminds us that young ones tended geese or sheep, chasing them through fields, inventing games as they worked. When the clerk wrote to geese, he did not see the child with muddy feet running behind them, giggling at their flapping wings. Yet those sounds were part of the life that the tax rolls reduced to tally marks. Communal work could also turn into moments of connection. Obligations to repair a bridge, to provide timber, or to maintain a mill brought villagers together. What appears as one cartload of wood in the records might have been an afternoon of shared labor, men and women hauling beams side by side, pausing to rest, trading jokes to lighten the effort. For a little while, the burden of duty became the bond of fellowship. Even in times of hardship, there was resilience expressed in joy. Festivals continued during years of scarcity, though perhaps with fewer foods and simpler songs. People clung to celebration as a way to affirm life in the face of endless demands. The record kept its dull tone lists of arrears, measures unpaid, but the villagers still carved out space for connection, so, while the clerk's hand captured only the obligations, the reality behind those lines was fuller, warmer. There was laughter behind the lambs, music behind the grain, children behind the geese. The tax rolls are boring because they are incomplete. They remind us of duties owed, but not of joys shared. Yet we, reading centuries later, can supply what the ink omits. We can picture the villagers gathering after payment, relieved for a night, dancing despite the weight of tomorrow, and perhaps that is the quiet gift of these dull records. They not only tell us of obligation, but they invite us to imagine the joy that balanced it. The monotony becomes a backdrop against which human connection shines brighter, a reminder that even in a world of endless dues, people found time to laugh, to sing, and to belong. Night settles slowly over the medieval village. The fields fall quiet, the animals draw into their pens, and the smoke from the last fires drifts into the dark. Inside the cottages, families huddle close, the day's work finished, the day's burdens paid or postponed, and somewhere, in a chest of oak bound with iron, the tax records rest, rolled tight, tied with twine, waiting for another dawn. It is here, in the stillness, that we reflect on what these records truly mean. They are not thrilling stories. They do not blaze with color or excitement. They are quiet, repetitive, and almost painfully dull. But in their dullness lies their strength. For while chronicles boast of kings and wars, the tax rolls whisper of ordinary people whose lives were measured in chickens, in sacks of barley, in coins so small they rattled lightly in the hand. Imagine the clerk himself preparing for sleep, his back stiff from bending, his eyes sore from squinting at tiny script. He sets aside the quill, scrapes the last bit of ink back into the pot, and places the parchment in its chest. Perhaps he kneels for a short prayer. Perhaps he stretches out on a straw mattress, no softer than the peasants' own beds. He drifts into rest, his mind still echoing with the monotone rhythm of names and numbers. The villagers, too, after their labors, rest beneath thatched roofs. Their lives, written down as obligations, are in reality warm and human. A mother soothes a child with a soft song. A father dreams of a better harvest. Young lovers whisper in the dark, their hands brushing, their thoughts far from the ledger that lists their family's dues. Even as the record reduces them to entries, their humanity persists, breathing and dreaming in the silence of night. And for us, centuries later, there is comfort in this monotony. Reading the old rolls is like listening to the steady tick of a clock. No surprises, no sudden drama, only the calm repetition of life as it was lived. It is history without haste, history without spectacle. It is the kind of history that allows the mind to rest as the night deepens. The silence around the records grows heavier. The chest that holds them sits undisturbed, its contents forgotten by all but those who demanded them. Yet, in that silence, the ink waits patiently. The names and numbers do not fade with the setting sun. They linger, quiet and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of time. You might picture the parchment itself dry, stiff, faintly yellowed even in its own day. The clerk's letters march across it in tight rows, identical and unyielding. Each stroke of the quill was a moment of concentration, a small act of endurance. Together, those strokes created a pattern that has survived centuries, a pattern so boring in its rhythm that it becomes strangely soothing to behold. The villagers, by contrast, did not think of permanence. Their lives were filled with small struggles, fleeting joys, and constant toil. Yet, unknowingly, they entrusted their memory to these ledgers. Because their dues were written, their existence is not lost. Because the clerk was thorough, they are not forgotten. Long after their cottages crumbled, their fields changed hands, and their names ceased to be spoken aloud, the records carried them forward. There is a gentle humility in that thought. History, so often told as a tale of glory, is here reduced to eggs, lambs, and pennies. And yet, in that reduction, there is honesty. Life was not grand for most. It was ordinary, repetitive, often dull. The records preserve that truth better than any epic. They remind us that the foundation of society rested not on kings, but on peasants, whose names fill line after line of ink. So, as you listen, let the monotony carry you. Let the endless list soften into a rhythm, a lullaby of obligations long since paid. The villagers are at rest. The clerks are at rest. The records, though silent, are at rest too, lying quietly in their chests. And you, hearing their story, may also find rest, because boredom, when stretched across centuries, becomes peace. The boring history of medieval tax records is not a tale of excitement. It is a tale of stillness, of persistence, of endurance. And as you close your eyes, you may feel yourself drifting with it, carried gently into sleep by the steady murmur of names and numbers, whispering softly from the past, ordinary, repetitive, human,